Just before I start, I would like to just acknowledge a few people. Obviously, thanks to RSPO for inviting us here today. Thanks also to acknowledge the chair of the Compensation Task Force, Olivier Touchet, who is, this is joint work between us, and my colleague from ERE Consulting, Randolph Jeremiah, and of course the Secretariat, who've helped us throughout all along. And there were a lot of other people whom we consulted during this exercise. It was a brief but very intensive time for us, and it got us to where we are today, as you will see. The background to this is that we were commissioned by the Biodiversity and High Conservation Value Working Group at the request of the Executive Board. The aim was for us to facilitate the development of an RSPO position on compensation for land use, for land clearance rather, after November 2005, where there is no prior HCV assessment. This was something that the Executive Board determined was necessary in order to have a permanent compensation mechanism. Now, as Shakespeare might have said, a rose by any other name would smell as sweet. He probably wouldn't have said it about the Rafflesia, but you know, that's a more local illustration. Well, what's in a name? The point about this is that we will be talking about compensation all the time. That is the term we will use. In fact, what we mean more than that, we use that term because it's in the principles, but we are really, for the most part, talking about remediation. This is not just simple compensation. So, why is this needed? Criteria 7.3 states that new plantings since November 2005 should not have replaced primary forest or any area that is required to maintain or enhance one or more high conservation values. The NIs of Indonesia and Malaysia nevertheless create allowance for land clearance without prior HCV assessment after November 2005, but before November 2007, in order to allowance for land clearance without prior HCV assessment during that period, and it is allowed to rectify this situation through a compensation mechanism. It has been felt that there is an urgency among RSPO members to get the necessary compensation mechanism defined and operational with clear guidance as to the process of compensating. So the process that we went through, the facilitation process, ours, was a series of consultations with experts. We had quite a number of people we consulted from different sectors. We had 2 stakeholders consultation workshops, one in Kuala Lumpur and one in Jakarta, during the very short period of this whole study, which was just July to October. It was steered by the BHCV working group, and thanks to them and their chairman, Dato Henry. And it was facilitated by the compensation task force that was set up by the working group. And that comprised growers, NGOs, and financing representative. We came up with the process, we came up with a number of principles which we call fundamentals so that there won't be confusion. The fundamentals, the first one is that whatever compensation mechanism is finalized must be globally consistent with local adaptations where necessary. And they might be addressed through NIs, for example. Secondly, the compensation actions must be economically viable for responsible growers. You're running a business, you need to be able to incorporate the compensation actions reasonably within that business. So that has to be clear. It can't be so burdensome that you walk away from it, for example. The compensation costs, nevertheless, should escalate over time in order to discourage what everybody has referred to as clear and pay. Basically, I think what we're all joined in not wanting is we don't want a situation where it becomes simply an economic question. Shall we clear that area of high conservation value because we can afford to pay for it? Clearly that isn't the objective. The objective is to retain as much HGV areas, much of the values as possible, and to remediate where that is not possible in situ or in the original place. Incentives will be provided for companies that undertake efforts on transparency. The idea behind that is that it works a lot better if people say, yep, we have a problem here, or we have an issue that we would like you to look at, rather than waiting for somebody else to raise it. Fixed goalposts are necessary. There was a lot of discussion about the need not to have ambiguities, the need to have things clearly communicated, and for any business to know what is required of them so that they can then plan and do their work accordingly. As far as the different HGV values is concerned, the biodiversity and environmental ones, whilst it is desirable that they should be remediated or compensated in situ, that isn't always possible, so that'll have to be a case-by-case basis. As far as the social HCVs are concerned, numbers 4 to 6, clearly they have to be applied for the local community who have been impacted by the loss of value. So that has to be a priority, and it has to be governed through dialogue, interaction with the affected parties. And although there should be fixed goalposts, etc., for any particular operation and so on, there will be reviews and updates. They're anticipated to be needed. It's felt that any reviews and updates of the mechanism should coincide with the review of the P&C. It was also agreed on the time frames. These were clarified. The first 2 years, November 2005 to November 2007, companies are required to compensate for lost HGV areas as a result of land clearance, so that's a straight compensation issue. From December 2007 to December 2009, when we've got to the end of, essentially the first 2 years are understood to be something of a grace period as this was being implemented. From December 2007 to December 2009, companies, everybody will be required to compensate the total area cleared without anything cleared without prior HGV assessment. And then from January 2010 on, companies required to compensate for the total area cleared, plus the suggestion is a multiplier should become more expensive as time goes on because it should be happening less and less. All this was agreed by consensus by the Biodiversity and High Conservation Value Working Group, which was very heartening. But nevertheless, there is a thorny issue. What happens when you acquire land after 2005? The growers had not fully understood or taken on board the fact that if they acquire such land at that time, the growers as a group in generally are saying, this meant that they would be taking on responsibility for anything that had happened in terms of loss of HGV on that land ever since November 2005. This was difficult to find a solution to this because there was also the view that that was the case, they should stand by that. But after considerable discussion and looking at the practicalities of what's reasonable, it was agreed at the working group that if not so much at the CTF to get the procedure right, it was agreed at the working group if land has been previously cleared, whether or not it's been planted for a commercial purpose, then the company that acquires that land will be required to bear the responsibility for rectifying non-compliances since November 2005. That means that if it was cleared or planted in a non-commercial manner, typically by local communities or smallholders, the company would not be so required, would not be subject to compensating for non-compliances. This was felt to be the solution to what is practical for the companies to take on with when they take on the burden and the necessity for due diligence and so on of new land. It was agreed that all members should be required to disclose the extent of their land holdings that have been cleared without prior HGV assessment since 2005, and this would apply to new members before their first certification audit, to existing members before the next annual progress report in 2012. So this leaves us with some next steps. The ERE needs to deliberate on, or will, I understand, be deliberating on these recommendations on Friday. We have also given some recommended rules, but since the EB has not deliberated on the fundamentals yet, we're not in a position to report on those rules. Clearly, more work is going to be needed to finalize the mechanisms, and that should take place before the next GA. There will be complications, for example, in the one about commercial or non-commercial clearance. But that said, companies are welcome to start with remediation work in consultation with RSPO using these fundamentals. And finally, this was the last point that came beyond the terms of reference, but this whole thing is a shared responsibility. Everybody's in it together who produces or uses palm oil. So we felt that the growers are taking a very large part of this burden, therefore, and we'd like to see the requirement for compensation addressed more. The whole high conservation value issue addressed more as the responsibility not only of the growers and all other parts of the industry downstream, but even down to the retailers and consumers and so on. The NGOs and the growers, particularly in the working group, were united in saying that they would like to move forward and work on that. So I'm 10 seconds over my time. Apologies, Mr. Chairman.